All right, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. My name is Guy McPherson. My mission is to raise the awareness of trauma and to support and inspire new trauma therapists just starting out on the trauma-informed journey. I do that with my membership community, Trauma Therapist 2.0, my online courses and workshops, and the Trauma Therapist newsletter. If you're a therapist of any kind and you work with individuals who've been impacted by trauma, I invite you to head on over to my website at thetraumatherapistproject.com. That's thetraumatherapistproject.com. All right, let's get started. All right, so 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. All right, folks, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. I'm very excited to have as my guest today, Luis Mojica. Luis, welcome.
Thank you, my friend. It's so good to be here.
All right. So Luis is the founder of, is that a bird in the background I'm hearing?
That's a cat.
That's a cat. Okay. No worries. No worries. I have cats too. Luis is the founder of Holistic Life Navigation, a form of trauma therapy that integrates whole food nutrition, self-inquiry, and somatic experiencing. He's a somatic therapist who specializes in trauma, addiction, and PTSD. He's also the director of nutrition and detox services at Samadhi, and a holistic recovery center in Kingston, New York. Luis, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much.
All right, sir. Before we get going here, share with the listeners where you're from originally and where you are currently.
I was born in Pennsylvania. I currently live in upstate New York in Woodstock.
Okay. Where in Pennsylvania?
A little town called Lebanon.
Okay. I used to live there as well, in Pennsylvania.
I was in Lebanon? Wow.
No. I'm a product of the tri-state area.
Okay. What part of Pennsylvania were you in?
I was in like the main line, like Haverford, and went to school at what was Philadelphia College of Art a long time ago.
Got it.
But anyway, we're here to talk about you. All right, so let's start. How the heck did you get into working in the field of trauma?
Oh, it's such an incredible journey because I started my own initiation by being traumatized, right? So I grew up with so much developmental trauma. I'm actually gonna let my cat out. She really wants to go outside.
Sure. I'm gonna get a bite of my bagel here.
So it started with my own experience of being traumatized. I didn't really have a name for it, but I felt the suffering, I felt the pain, I felt the anxiety. And my way of kind of coping and soothing that charge inside of me, all that adrenaline, was through binge eating. So I spent most of my 10 years old till I was 17 or so binge eating and getting very sick.
If I may, trauma, you said trauma from what?
Trauma, I had sexual assault. I had relational trauma. There were developmental traumas in my body.
Wow.
I was born with an intersex expression. So my body made all this excess estrogen through puberty. And so I actually developed breasts and hips. And if you can imagine how difficult it is going through school, right? Already, imagine being a man with breasts and hips. So there were the amount of bullying, the amount of hatred, the amount of sexual assault, personal shame, everything I had from this unique body that didn't have a name at the time. There were no titles like intersex or gender fluid or non-binary. That didn't exist when I was growing up in the 80s and 90s. So I just had this body that no one knew what it was or what to do with. Doctors didn't even understand what was going on. They just knew my hormones were more female than male. So it was being really born into that body and enduring a lot of the pain relationally and the disconnect from how that body was treated and viewed. I felt this extreme disconnect from all things and all people, including myself. And so when I was around 10, 11, 12, I hit this depth of depression and despair where all I could do to live was eat. If I wasn't eating, I couldn't even be in my body because it felt so bad to be in it. Which all of this was really the gift, eventually, and the wisdom eventually, because then when I was around 15 or 16, I discovered nutrition just by accident. Juicing was the first thing I discovered. And I started it and all these symptoms started going away. Like my cholesterol was lowering, my asthma started getting better. All these kind of chronic illnesses I had just started dissipating.
All right, hang on a second. So you're saying a lot. I just want to make sure I'm catching all this stuff.
Yeah.
So when you, first of all, I mean, I can't imagine going through that. How did you see a therapist? Did you get some help? How did you deal?
No, I was completely alone in it. I mean, that's not true. I had a beautiful mother. So, and have a beautiful mother. So she was there with me as a good person and someone who was safe, but she didn't know half of what I went through. I was had so much shame, I just kept it buried. So I was very alone with it. Therapy was not accessible to me. In Southern Pennsylvania in the 80s and 90s, people did not go to therapy. Trauma still had that
Oh
title, which
my
I'm so
gosh.
glad it doesn't have anymore, where
Right.
it only happened if you went to war or almost were
Oh,
killed.
right.
So there wasn't the understanding of developmental trauma at the time. So I was diagnosed with a lot of things, and they were all trauma responses: ADHD, Tourette syndrome, nervous tics. I was prescribed Haldol. They wouldn't put me on
Wow.
antipsychotics. I was so anxious all the time.
Wow.
So yeah, there was no help. My first break was music. I strummed a guitar, and the sensations of the guitar on my body actually
Mm.
started settling my body for the first time ever.
Oh my gosh.
And that was the moment I thought, whoa, there's a feeling of my body that feels good. What is this? So I started kind of following that feeling, and that's what really led me to eating differently. And then I was majoring in psychology.
All right, how
And
old are we now?
okay, how old are we now? 19. So
Okay.
I'm 2 years into majoring in psychology. I'm in college, and I'm not seeing myself represented in the DSM. I come from a Puerto Rican Irish family. So I'm not seeing people of color. I'm not seeing queer people. I'm not seeing indigeneity or animism or all these things that I grew up with and loved so much. I was seeing this really kind of old Eurocentric
Mhm.
model of identifying expression as the person and as
Right.
the other, and as if something's wrong with them. And I have so many great friends who are psychologists, so no disrespect to psychology whatsoever. But I wanted something a little deeper. I went, ooh, there's this big spider just came over. Hello. I wanted something a little more in my body. I was like craving this somatic experience.
Mm.
And so I dropped out and went into nutrition and studied nutrition for 2 years, became a nutritional counselor. And then I just, for 10 years, had a private nutrition practice. And what was so fascinating was as I was working with people nutritionally, their traumas would start to come in the room through their food habits.
Mm.
So I was starting to notice, oh, this person's craving is what stimulates them out of their freeze, right? Let's say excess coffee drinking. And this person's late night binge eating with pizza and wine, this is how they're depressing their system when they're so activated and they can't sleep. So I had this intuition around it from being someone with PTSD, but I didn't have the language. I didn't have
Mhm.
tools because I dropped out of college. I was trying to figure out, how do I sit with this? And I found myself in the office of a somatic therapist as the patient. And within a few months, learning how to be with my body in a way I never had experienced. So I
Say
immediately,
say more about that.
so it's quite profound, actually. I was experiencing a tooth infection, and by this is age 25. And so let's say 13 to 15 years after these really big sexual traumas I experienced as a child, I had blacked them out. I didn't even think they happened anymore.
Mm.
And so I wasn't actually walking around with this conscious awareness of, oh, I went through this, I was raped, whatever it was. I didn't think of it that way. I just felt the pain in my body. I felt the fear of men. I felt those things, but didn't really understand why I held that. And then one day I had this tooth infection, and the pain that seared through my body took me right back to the moment of assault. And it was so visceral and what we would call a flashback. But it was a pure somatic experience that I didn't even experience then as a child because I was so dissociated. But now I was feeling the whole experience happening, and it was terrifying. So I immediately went to therapy. It was the first time in my life. I went from psychotherapist to psychotherapist, no one who was somatically trained.
Mhm.
And so they were really helpful at helping me identify and even recover more memory. But my body was getting more and more and more anxious and tense. And I had gone a good decade without experiencing anxiety or insomnia, but it was all coming back. And then again, these things happen in these kind of mysterious ways. But I find myself working with an art therapist who is somatically trained. And she said to me, what happened? Like, what's the experience? What's the flashback? And I'm telling her the story, and she pauses me, which no one's ever done. And she
Mm-hmm.
says, "Where do you feel that story in your body?" I was like, "Whoa, what do you what do you mean? I have a body?" And she said, "Where do you feel that in your body?" And I thought, oh my gosh, my stomach, my chest. And it was this immediate disidentifying with the story and the event and actually embodying where I was still carrying it. And it was this experience. I couldn't learn it in school. It was this experience of I'm carrying the event. All my therapy work up until then was just talking about the event,
Mm-hmm.
not even noticing how it was still being held in my body. So there was this incredible healing is such an overused word, but it was such a beautiful healing where my nervous system updated and it
Mm.
realized, oh, the event's over. You're in this room. How does that feel? And I lost the identity of, a
Wow.
survivor of sexual assault. And I gained this new awareness of here I am right now and it feels safe.
Oh my gosh.
It was profound.
Luis, man, talking to you, you can feel how you've taken the incredible traumatic experiences you've had, your uh childhood in a sense, and have brought them to the incredible work you're doing now. I mean, it's so, I mean, just to hear you talk about your experiences, it's crazy that people go through this.
Absolutely.
I mean,
Absolutely.
I just like how do you get through school with this, dealing with this?
I didn't. I
I
was I
mean,
was failing. I had behavioral issues. I had all these things that and that's why I think I had that felt sense of dropping out of school because I didn't want to go into a business of classifying people. I knew there was a deeper thing to these
mhm,
behaviors, and all of my behaviors were frozen as my identity. But they
mhm.
were these subconscious cries for help, and I didn't know that. No one else, and innocently, no one else knew that. They were doing their best.
So
But it
interesting.
does it is profound to think how people survive life, right?
Well, yeah, but I think to go through, admittedly, to be born, however you want to phrase it, to be born into or with the body you had. I mean, there's enough, we have enough wondering what the hell's going on, but you have both these things going on. And
Yeah.
I want to jump to that point where you were working with people in nutrition and you were kind of drawing points or lines to, well, what was causing this in a sense. That seems like a really interesting epiphany or realization. How what made you think of that?
I'm getting chills as you ask it because it kind of takes me back to that feeling of just excitement of realizing there was this connection. Um, and I mean, so I always bring up rashes as a great analogy. So someone has a rash, and it's common culture to want to get rid of the rash. It's not as common to inquire from where is it blossoming, like from where is it
Mm.
emerging in me. Trauma response and behaviors are the same thing. It's we see them and want to get rid of them, our addictions, our
Right.
compulsions, right, whatever. But they're literally signals to something we can't see. It's something we can see from a place that we can't.
Mm-hmm.
So I was so interested in what's the place I can't see as a nutritionist, because I was trained in that way of you see a rash as not the problem, but as a language, something
Mm.
speaking to you. What does that tell me about your liver? What does that tell me about your emotions? And so over this decade of doing nonstop nutrition work with people, I just started learning more and more.
Wow.
Oh, the people that had traumatic events had these really specific food cravings at certain times. And oh, adrenal fatigue is also hand in hand with the people that have PTSD. And so the biology of trauma started showing itself to me through my practice without any training, just in the field of witness and of
Mm-hmm.
observation. And I think it was really I would say it actually clicked. I was in my second year of somatic experiencing training, and I learned this relationship between soluble fiber, specifically beans, and their ability to remove bile acids from the gut. So this is like a biochemist
Mm-hmm.
findings. This woman, her name's Karen Hurd, And she did 30 plus years of research to notice, oh, when someone
Wow.
eats beans, it removes adrenaline from their gut, and adrenaline recycles itself. And the moment I got that hit of information, it all just came together. And I realized, wow, nutrition is a huge modality for trauma healing that we've never really tapped into or learned about. So I started practicing it in my private practice and with my body.
Mm.
And the results have been profound.
Wow.
Uh, you'll have someone in trauma therapy, really great somatic work, everything, getting out of toxic relationships, and the body still won't settle. And then you'll say, what do you eat? And you'll learn, oh, I have coffee in the morning. I skip my meals. I have wine before I go to bed. And you realize their biology is actually one of adrenaline, which is turning on their fight or flight responses.
At what point did you start getting into and pursue somatic experiencing?
I would say 5 months into my own somatic therapy, like receiving it as the patient or client, I was just feeling such a profound shift in my biology. At that point, I was getting chronic migraines about 3 or 4 times a week,
Wow.
debilitating ones, right? I couldn't work, I couldn't move. And then in the work with her, I was noticing how my shoulders were always like this from hiding my breasts growing up. So even though this was 15 years later, I've had top surgery since then. No one would know if I didn't tell this story. So, I pass, everything just seems like it was gone. My shoulders still remembered that they were
Mm.
there. My shoulders hadn't updated. So over a couple months, my shoulders started doing this and coming down, and my migraines started going away. And I thought, I have got to learn this modality. I
Hmm.
really want people to have this freedom in their body that I'm gaining. Because food was the way into it.
Hmm.
But then there's the relationship with the body that we were never taught. But somatic experiencing teaches that. And that's what I was really interested in.
So let me remind everyone, I'm speaking with Luis Mojica. Luis, what's the best way for people to get in contact with you?
I would say my website is holisticlifenavigation.com.
Okay. So we'll have that listed here at the show notes page at the traumatherapistpodcast.com. So at what point did you switch or transition consciously and say, you know what, I want to help people? I mean, you were obviously working with nutrition, but it sounds like things shifted and trauma became more. How talk to us about that shift?
I would say I literally became obsessed with trauma, which just obsessed because I started seeing trauma out of a lens of something's wrong with us or me,
Mm-hmm.
and through the lens of, oh, trauma is nature. It's our trauma response is part of our nature. Traumatic events are part of nature. Traumatized isn't necessarily as part of nature as it is human nature. And
Mm-hmm.
so I started getting really interested in seeing it through this more kind of like even artistic, poetic lens instead of something bad and medical, which I had seen it for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
And I think for me, that shift really came down to just the pure biology again and energetics of it. And so I was thinking of things like sneezes. Pollen goes into the nose. It's foreign. It feels like a possible threat to the body. The body just reflexively sneezes it out. No one identifies with their sneeze. No one feels shame for
Right.
sneezing. We don't talk about sneezing. It just happens. I thought, why can't trauma be that normal? Like our trauma responses, rather. Why can't those be as innocent as a sneeze? So I really got into this desire to destigmatize our trauma responses and actually revere them and respect them and learn how to communicate with them. And once I started doing that with myself and with my clients, I was just so lit up from that practice.
Mm-hmm.
Nutrition felt too limiting. It felt
Mm-hmm.
like part of the practice, but not the only part. So I walked away from that and just to pursue the trauma healing work.
Why do you think we have those strong slash negatives slash medical responses to trauma?
I truly believe it's because of colonization. And I say that because when I think of the act of colonization, and we all have different, everyone listening will have a different example of what that means to them. But the actual act of colonization is when one land takes over another, like one people takes over another through dominance. I'm always going back to this early place. I'm always trying to imagine, what if I was a trauma therapist during this time of colonization, when they
Mm-hmm.
started colonizing the Americas and Puerto Rico and all these islands and places. And I'm imagining if I was sitting with those bodies, those people, they're definitely in fight or flight response. These are not embodied, calm, open people. These are scared defense people who are going into a fight essentially to take over another group of people or country. But I say this because there's this early kind of diversion where we went from honoring body and land as equal relatives to mind over body, mind over land, and this idea of dominance instead of relationship. So, in cultures that really love the body and relate to the body and see everything through an animistic lens of, everything's alive and we're all here for and with each other, there isn't so much shame about what the body does. If it laughs really loud, if it shakes, if it screams, if it cries, it's kind of like, yeah, that's beautiful. It's like a beautiful waterfall. It just looks like nature.
Mm-hmm.
As we get into this mind over matter, mind over body mentality, we start to think that there's things wrong with the body when it does something that's inconvenient. And in a post-colonial world, it's very inconvenient to interrupt progress. So when we're in our overworking, when we're in a dominant place, wherever it is we're in,
Right.
culturally or individually, to feel tender and to pause into these responses as they come up, it seems vulnerable and weak, and it scares us, from that forward movement. So I've really seen it through a like, your question is a great one, because I see it as a result. Our stigma with these trauma responses is the result of being colonized and thinking these bodies are these wild creatures and there's a problem with them. As we decolonize the psyche, we just start to see them as part of nature, and it's not so scary.
Now, what about in terms of sexual assault?
Mm-hmm.
Because there a lot of times shame comes up in that realm. How do you frame that? How do you look at that? What's your explanation for how that's perceived in a sense?
Well, it depends, because there's so many nuances to that. There's
Sure.
the fawn response that comes up where we are being pursued or forced sexually, and we don't fight back. And the fawn response is a reflexive response to help you live. So we live through a sexual assault. We didn't say no or fight back, and we feel shame because of that. So one way I always work with that is teaching people the mechanism of fawning, where your body socially engages against what it actually wants because it feels unsafe not to. So
Mm-hmm.
it's a survival mechanism. Me not saying no to my abuser is actually why I'm here and able to talk to you.
Right.
That's brilliant. If I identify with my body not saying no, if I said, what's wrong with me? I should have, I'm identifying with the trauma response of fawning, and then I'm in a spiral of shame for most of my life. So it's that disidentifying with the response itself is how I work with trauma response through this lens.
So let's, if you can, give us an example. And I know it's different for every person, but how do you work? It seems like you have such an array of experiences to draw from and techniques to draw from. But when you work, first of all, what kind of clients do you work with?
Yeah, it took me so long to figure out how to integrate this array, because it's quite a lot of things. I started working in private practice. So I would say for the last 5 years, I've been in a full-time private practice with trauma healing,
Okay.
with couples, with families, and individuals. And so the way I work with a person, if it's in private practice, it would be hearing their experience, like the first session, just kind of learning where they're coming from so they can tell their story. And then every session after that, or even in the first one at times, embodying the story. Where do I actually feel the story in my body as I tell Lew-Eace? And a lot of education, teaching people this isn't like typical talk therapy. Like, we're going to
Mm-hmm.
talk, but I'm going to pause you a lot. I'm going to ask you to notice your body a lot. I'm going to give you permission to make weird sounds and faces and anything your body wants to do. Because what's so cool about this work is the body knows how to regulate itself and knows how to discharge trauma. Again, our mind over matter, our conditioning of even 4 years old, stay still, don't wiggle in that chair. We learn that we get rewarded when we overcome the body. So then when someone says something to me and I want to do that, I want to shiver, I want to move, I don't, because I look weird.
Mm-hmm.
So I kind of help them unlearn that learned behavior. However, more recently, I'm actually in the process of closing private practice, because now I'm really into classes. I do a 6-week course and I teach everybody the foundations of this work, a whole week on nutrition, a whole week on the biology of trauma,
Wow.
so they can actually learn it and start doing it themselves or with another therapist if they want. I find that to be almost better than private because
Yeah.
they're really learning how to apply it themselves. That makes sense.
There's something about you that you exude genuineness.
Oh,
You exude uh authenticity. And I'm wondering, given your history, if that was a struggle for you to be with, to sit with, to acknowledge, to honor.
mm. I appreciate the observation and how you feel. Yeah, I would say I was so hated growing up that I had teachers escort me from one classroom to the other because of all the threats to my life. I I could never I would never want to inflict that on another. So at such a young age, going through so much pain and being hated and isolated from others, I just kind of it was just this natural sense of I always want to connect. If
Mm-hmm.
someone is a quote horrible person, I still want to connect to that person. Doesn't mean I put myself in harm's way, but I don't want to ever other or distance myself from somebody. So I think having found a safety in my body, I've also had this ability to be really open to people in most situations and not be guarded.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's what you're asking. If you're not, you can ask again, but that's
Yeah,
that's
I
how it feels.
am. I'm just wondering if that came natural to you. It sounds like you had this innate, because of what you experienced, you had this almost reflexive compassion
Yes,
for other people.
that's a good way to
And
put it.
and I mean, we each have our own experiences, but I'm wondering for you if it was, because it seems like such a major, for me, in this conversation, it seems like such a major component to the work you do.
Mm,
You know, it's
hmm.
so we need people like you, is what I'm saying. Seriously. And I don't, and I'm just curious about that journey for you. You know, we talk a lot about, or I do, um, the importance of inner work for therapists.
Mm,
And
hmm.
was, to what degree was that a struggle for you to be the amazing person you are, in a sense?
I love that question because if I think back and I see myself from, I always see age 10 to age 15 as just the hell years. It was the hardest. And I still didn't have a hatred. There was that reflexive compassion, but I felt so alone and I hated myself actually. It went into myself. So when I started writing music, that's when I started actually processing what was inside and seeing it on a paper and singing it. I didn't even know what I was saying. It was very symbolic, the words. But looking back, I was looking at these songs and I was 15, like, oh my gosh, that's about my assault. I had no idea I was
Mm,
writing about that. So that process, I think, really helped me. I guess what it did was it gave me this tool to go into these deep parts of myself that I've hated, that I was ashamed of, that I was afraid to go to, and feel really safe and even see them as something beautiful. So it's hard for me to be around other people and not see that in them. And I
mm-hmm.
think that transfers, when I'm with someone, they know anything they tell me, it's not going to rock me. I've been to such
Right,
deep pain. And
right.
and that so that's where I really, even more than my training, I moved from that place.
Well, that to me is the gold. You know, that to me is what this is all about. I mean, that really is what I hope my podcast about, because
Mm.
you that's what we need, connection like that, right? We need to
Yes.
feel, I mean, the fact that you're able to present or create a space where the people you're working with can feel that is profound, and
I
it's not easy.
I couldn't agree more. I think that's what I was always seeking when I was looking for a therapist or someone to help.
Right.
It wasn't even the therapy, it was I wanted a body that could handle my body and feel
Right.
safe with. And so I completely agree with you.
Wow.
How good that feels.
All right. So um these classes you're offering, are they available now? How do people access them?
These are live. And so I teach about 3 or 4 a year
Oh, okay.
and they go 6 weeks. And so people can sign up and they take them and there's a ton of support and we meet a couple times a week and everything's on my website with those.
Okay. Okay, awesome.
Yeah.
And again, we'll have that listed here. Luis's website is holisticlifenavigation.com, holisticlifenavigation.com. Luis, you are one intense dude, and I've got to have you back at a later
Oh,
date.
thank you.
Love to have you back, man.
Yeah,
Yeah.
the first moment I first heard your voice a few years ago, I felt immediately safe. And so I really appreciate your presence, and it's so nice to connect with you now.
Likewise. All right, so we will be in touch, and yeah, this is awesome. Great meeting you. Thank you so much.
Okay, my friend, take care.
All right. Thank you so much for listening and supporting this podcast. And if you'd like to join the hundreds of other therapists who are each month keeping up to date and informed and inspired about what's going on in the world of trauma, I'd love to invite you to head on over to the Trauma Therapist newsletter. That's the traumatherapistnewsletter.com.